Yeah, family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Father Richard Gould's next chapter is on the church and the moral life. So now that we've decided to follow Jesus, we're discipling Jesus, we're following in Jesus' footsteps, but it's not just about me and Jesus, it's about us and Jesus. As Catholics, we've always focused on the community, so that it's not just us focusing on our own individual salvation, so much as us thinking about the community, our relationship to one another, thinking about the church. So the role of the church in the moral life is larger than magisterial teachings. When we often think of the magisterial teachings that have been handed down to us by the bishops, but the church is more than that. The church, Father Richard Gould divides it into various sections. He says, for instance, that the church is the shaper of moral character, the bearer of moral tradition, and the community of moral deliberation. Let's talk about what he means by each of those three. First of all, the church is the shaper of moral character. The church helps to shape our moral character, which simply means that we talked about how it is that there's this threefold model of see, judge, and act. That we as human beings, we see something, we judge it, and then we make a decision based on that. How it is that the way that we see, judge, and act is influenced to the various communities that we belong to. So our families, our friends, our schools, our church, all these communities are going to give us ways of seeing and judging and acting. Liturgy, every time that we gather for Mass, the fancy word for Mass is liturgy. Liturgy is a fancy Greek word meaning work. It's the work of all of us together, the work that we do as Catholics. That informs our moral imagination. There are certain things that we do at Mass as part of our liturgy that help to influence our imagination. But there's also a caution. Father Richard dedicates an entire paragraph to this on page 201, perhaps you read it, where he talks about how it is that the Roman Catholic Mass, and this is where we can pat ourselves on the back as part of the American Catholic Church, we have less of this, but in the Roman Catholic tradition, he says that the Mass incorporates a division of the sexes in two ways. How do we divide the sexes, men and women, in the Roman Catholic Church? One is through the use of all male exclusive language for God. So Jesus gives us these great images of God being like a woman looking for coins. And yet when we pray together, do we use lots of maternal images for God? Not a lot. A lot of the image that we use for God is using pronouns like him or he or his. When we're referring to God, we know that God is without gender, God is without sex, which means that God is as much her as God is him. God's things are as much hers as they are his, but we're just conditioned to think in terms of God being more male or masculine than female or feminine. So how interesting that the church has done that tradition, and also the way in which the church has excluded women from various ministries in the church is also a way in which we are not being the inclusive community that Jesus had imagined. So the church is the shaper of moral character. The church shapes how it is that we live our lives. The church is the bearer of moral tradition, meaning that as Catholics we have all these years of tradition. We have 2,000 years of tradition as a church that we bring into part of our decision making. So the tradition of natural law, philosophy, and theology from St. Thomas Aquinas, as Catholics we continue to look to the past because that tradition continues to shape what we think and what we believe today. So the church has a body of official moral teaching to provide guidance and to inform the conscience. Father Richard breaks down how it is that within the church there are different people who bear the moral tradition in different ways. There are the laity who witness by their lives and serve the church in a number of ways. I think of, for instance, on Sundays when Rafaela is teaching the children as part of the Children's Liturgy of the Word, she's sharing our tradition, the traditions of our church, the stories of our faith with those children. We can do that as laypersons. There are pastoral ministers who help to interpret the faith for the specific lives of people. So anyone who has a ministry within the church is helping people to better understand their faith. Theologians help to interpret our faith They take things like scripture and tradition and the church's teachings, and they help to make sense of those things in light of our contemporary world. They ask critical questions. They offer new interpretations of the faith. And there's also the hierarchy or the magisterium of the church, and we want to recognize them as well, simply because it's the hierarchy that unites the church, so that we're not breaking off into individual churches in different places. The hierarchy that brings us all together. Father Richards notes how it is that bishops are the only ones in the church who share the church's official teaching. So how interesting, Father Jamie can talk about the tradition of the church, but Father Jamie never says that what he says is the official teaching of the church. I say, the bishops share the official teaching of the church. Father Jamie, anything that he creates, he doesn't say, this is what the church will now believe. So only bishops speak for the church, and the rest of us are seen as representing them in their ministry. So the hierarchy, the magisterium, bishops, have traditionally seen themselves as having three duties with respect to the moral life. How it is that they have a responsibility to affirm the faith, to protect the faith, and to promote the faith. So the way that they promote the faith is that they are teachers themselves. They teach through decrees and encyclicals, exhortations, declarations, pastoral letters. They teach us. They ensure that proper church teaching is provided by other teachers, so that if someone were teaching something that doesn't belong to the faith of the church, then they would be the ones to tighten the screws and say, wait a minute, what you're teaching is not in line with our church's teachings. It's not Catholic. And they also determine which teachers and teachings are in conformance with accepted teachings, so that in the Roman Catholic Church, the words that we've used have been words like the mandatum. Did you know that in order to teach theology in a Roman Catholic university, you need a mandatum, you need the bishop's permission to teach theology in the Catholic university within that diocese? This is relatively new, only since maybe the early, I'm guessing it's maybe sometime in the late 90s that the mandatum came to be. Theologians were all upset because who are you bishops to tell me that I can or cannot teach theology in this university? Bishops and theologians have different tasks in the church. Theologians ask questions. So the mandatum, and also imprimaturs. Have we seen inside a book? Sometimes you'll see an imprimatur, which simply means that a bishop has read that book and has determined that that book is Catholic, that that book fits within the faith. Is it absolutely necessary for a book to have an imprimatur? If we opened up Reason Informed by Faith, do we find an imprimatur inside that book? I'm not seeing anything inside the cover of that book. Usually it's inside the cover of the book where a bishop gives his or her imprimatur. It's him or her saying that this book is Catholic. Most theologians don't necessarily, for them, getting the imprimatur of a bishop, the bishop's permission to publish a work like this, is not important to them. So the church is a shaper of moral character and a bearer of moral tradition. Father Richard says the church is also a community of moral deliberation, discerning together what's right and wrong, good or bad. The church challenges us to move beyond our own emotive responses to issues. When we see certain issues, we have our own feelings about that issue. Okay, the church says that's fine. Let's move beyond that and see how it is that our faith can inform what it is that you're thinking and feeling and deciding. And so that brings us to the issue of dissent in the church, which is good because in a previous chapter we talked about the conscience and the magisterium, how it is that sometimes the church teachers, bishops, tell us something and it goes against what our conscience is telling us or our experience, our reason is telling us. So dissent, says Father Richard Gula, is an indispensable part of the learning and teaching process of the church, meaning dissent is important. It is important that we have dissent in the church because it tells us something about those teachings. Dissent has been present throughout history, so that, for instance, St. Paul and St. Peter, they had a disagreement on whether or not they should be Jewish or not. Should the Gentiles be circumcised, or should there be more freedom with respect to the law? There was dissent back then, Why should we expect that we're all going to live and get along perfectly and there won't be any dissent nowadays, say between theologians and bishops, or between bishops and the faithful? The church does change its position over time on various issues, so that at one time the church advocated for slavery. Does the church still advocate for slavery? It's changed its position. And so that helps to keep us humble. With respect to dissent, it's part of being a mature Catholic or Christian is realizing that the church changes its position. And so there are many positions that the church has on certain issues now. It's conceivable that the church could change its position. With Pope Francis being in office, isn't it true that the church is changing, or at least looking at some of its positions on those who are divorced and remarried, right? On the place of women in the church, right? How it is that the church changes its stance on various issues over time. And so the church has traditionally encouraged dissent, so long as that dissent is individual and private, rather than public and voiced. What's the difference between private and internal versus public? So before we get into those criteria, essentially the criteria that we came up with in 1968 for dissent was that if you're going to dissent about something in the church, it's got to be serious and well-founded, meaning you have good reasons to say what you're saying. It's well-founded. The manner of dissenting must not impugn the teaching authority of the church, which means you don't make the bishops look bad. So, one, you've got to have good reasons. Two, you've got to help the bishops to save face. Right? You're not impugning the teaching authority of the church. And number three, that your dissent cannot give rise to scandal. So that, for instance, by my inviting a Hispanic Roman Catholic U.S. Congressman to Cristo Rey, the fear was that I would give scandal to the entire Catholic Church. Why? Because of that congressman's voting record on a single issue. How scandalous that we would invite a Roman Catholic Hispanic U.S. Congressman to talk in a Roman Catholic church because of his or her stance on a single issue. It might give scandal, it could be a cause of scandal for some people in the church. So, Richard McCormick, when we're trying to figure out, okay, what makes for good dissent within the church, Richard McCormick suggested then that let's formulate some clear criteria for dissent so that if Archbishop Johnson walks in the room and says something, or Bishop Vasquez, or anyone else, we have a new bishop in the diocese, what's his name? Any of our bishops, Garcia, right? So if Archbishop Johnson or Bishop Vasquez or Bishop Garcia, any of our bishops walk into the room today and say something, on what grounds, according to what criteria could we dissent? Are we ready? Number one, responsible dissent distinguishes between various degrees of authority of different teachings, meaning some teachings are more important than other teachings. So, when it comes to dissent then, if there are more important teachings that are central to the core of our faith, that God is three persons in one God, that's pretty central. So probably we would dissent on that less than we would on other things that are not so central to our faith, like eating pork. If a bishop comes in the room and says, "Thou shalt not eat pork," is that central to our faith? If not, then we have more freedom to dissent. Number two, responsible dissent follows only, let's understand this clearly. Responsible dissent follows when the only remaining reason left for holding a position is that it's being taught by the magisterium. Essentially saying, the only reason that I believe this is because you, the bishop, say that I need to believe this. There's no other reason for me to believe this. It goes contrary to my experience and goes contrary to reason. But the only reason that I believe it is because you say it. In that instance, then, responsible dissent can follow. The church is not necessarily encouraging us to believe things just because someone says to believe it. Right? If the only reason you're believing something is because someone said to believe it, then you can responsibly dissent. And finally, responsible dissent is proportionate to the competence of the person to make an assessment of the teaching at stake, simply meaning the more knowledge that you have about things of the church, the more competence you have to be able to dissent from that teaching. If you really don't know a lot about the church and don't understand the teaching, then you can't dissent in the same way. If you're thinking of dissenting, or if you've ever dissented with been in disagreement with any of the church's teachings, what are the ways that you can do this? There's internal dissent. That's when you disagree, but you keep it to yourself, right? For many years as a seminarian, I dissented internally, simply meaning the church taught certain things, but I was hopeful I was going to change the church. I had this vision, the Second Vatican Council of the 1960s, we were going to revolutionize the church, we were going to achieve this vision. And so with the things that I dissented, I just dissented internally, meaning you wouldn't know that I dissented because it's something inside of me. That's internal dissent. What is private dissent? Private dissent then is when it's no longer inside of people, when you share it with a person or two or three, but it's pretty well contained. So you're dissenting privately. So a few other people know now that I have my differences with the church on, for instance, the place of women in the church. I don't agree with the church on its treatment of women. A few people now know that, so now it's no longer internal inside of me. Now it's private. So long as they don't go blabbing that, then it's pretty private. Well, if they go start talking about that, what happens? Then it becomes public. Then it becomes public. The church always uses words like the internal forum versus the external forum. The internal forum means you've shared it with people that you can trust. But then what happens is, if any of those people tell someone else, then suddenly it's no longer the internal forum, it's the external forum. My age would be a good example. My age is a matter of the internal forum. I don't share it with anyone. I've never shared my age with anyone in this room. I don't remember sharing it with many people in this world. Unless Nana calls me and says, I need your birthday to be able to do whatever on your insurance policy. Say, Nana, we're sworn to secrecy. If anyone ever asks you, you're taking it to the grave. It's the internal forum. It's private, right? Nana knows it. I know it, but it's private. When Nana comes to Mass on Sunday and doesn't follow my orders to take it with her to the grave, but instead gets up at the microphone and announces the year of my birth, then it's no longer the internal forum. It's no longer private. Then it becomes public. Same with dissent then. Public dissent then is when it's known that I disagree with the teaching on the church. Most priests in the Roman Catholic Church, like myself, we have to be extremely careful because even though we may dissent and have our disagreements, it can't be too public. And then probably the most heinous type of dissent, the most sinister, we call organized dissent. There are two forms of organized dissent. One is when we openly disagree and we convene a conference or we convene a group of scholars, professionals to be able to talk about the church teaching and what's wrong with it or how we would change it. We refer to that as organized scholarly dissent, and when theologians or scholars come together. The other we refer to as organized popular dissent, and that's when we as people disagree and we start organizing ourselves. What's the danger in that? It sets up another magisterium, if you will, in opposition to the magisterium. We all know that power comes from one of two places, organizing people and or organizing money. When you start organizing people in opposition to the magisterium is going to put an end to that. So that, for instance, there have been Roman Catholic priests who have come out and who have participated in the ordinations of women. Ooh, wait a minute. That sends the wrong signal. We've got to do something about that.
So is there a council in the church, like the bishops, the cardinals, that try to dissent people, or do they dissent themselves from the church?
So what the magisterium will always say is that person chooses to remove him or herself from communion. So we call it an excommunication, right? Do the bishops excommunicate a person? They will say no. They'll say, you chose to excommunicate yourself. By whatever stance you took, by participating in the ordination of a woman, you are no longer Catholic, they would say. You have excommunicated yourself through your public dissent. Pope John Paul II said, we will not discuss the ordination of women. What did you do? You went to the ordination of a woman. You are now outside. You have excommunicated yourself.
Is there a formal list of people who've been excommunicated?
Ooh, that would be a good fun thing to Google, right? List of people excommunicated from the church. I have a feeling what you'll do is you'll get various, you'll Google various stories of people who've been excommunicated. Will you get a list? I'm not sure that there is a list. That would be fun to Google.
Bunch of sisters too, right? Bunch of them went to Canada.
Yeah,
well, excommunicated.
Because when people start to dissent from the church has to decide what to do with that. So long as it's internal or private, not a problem. If Janie has a problem with the church, but Janie's not telling anyone, good Janie, it's okay. She shares it with a few people, not such a huge deal. She tells Janie tonight on the ride home what she really disagrees about the church. We're not going to get too upset about that. When Janie starts going out in the streets and organizing mass protests outside the bishop's office, then we have to deal with Janie.
A lot of people are internal dissent. I mean, I
That's
see it
right.
when they don't get so many kids. The other one is every time I talk to somebody that's Roman Catholic and it's I wish they would let this get married.
There you go.
But and I said, well, why do you stay there if you don't believe? Well, you know, I mean, someday it's going to happen. I said, if you don't get organized, you never will.
So it's fascinating. Many people are leaving the church. It's really a form of dissent.
Yes.
When 1 out of every 3 persons is leaving the church, what that person is saying is, I can no longer be part of this group for whatever reason. This group is not who I am. My parents baptized me into this church, but I just have whatever disagreement with it. In the American Catholic Church, what happens when we start leaving issues of conscience to a person's conscience, then suddenly it's not judging you and making you feel like you are somehow not in communion with us. It's realizing we're all following in the footsteps of Christ, doing the best we can, and instead of pointing fingers, we're going to love one another. How's that for crazy?
That goes back to something we covered a while ago about being a good person or having good morals or virtues and everything, but not being Catholic or not being Christian at all. Like, isn't that I mean, that's what I think of. And then also authority. Now, why don't they feel like they can have dissent within their church? Is there not, like, where are you getting these messages from that you can't disagree at all? You know, this like narrative of accepting whatever you're told as done.
So why does that happen in families? Then think about it at a smaller level. Why do parents say, you're going to do this just because I said it? Okay, does that lead to happy relationships in the family? No, but at the same time, as kids, you know, take out the garbage. Why? Because I said to. Okay, we do these sorts of things. It doesn't necessarily create good relationships, but we weigh, there are certain types of dissent, and we have to weigh, we have to be mindful of the possible consequences of dissenting, which is why Father Richard Gula goes on to give various guidelines for dissent. If Archbishop Johnson or Bishop Vasquez or Bishop Garcia walk in the door and tell us something, and if you're thinking of dissenting, then let me give you a few guidelines. Okay? Number 1, make sure that you affirm the teaching authority of the church and that you don't deny the authority of the church to teach on moral matters. You're not laughing the bishop in his face saying, you can't tell me what to do. If you're dissenting, respectfully, you're hoping to remain within the church, then you're doing it in a way that affirms his or her position as a teacher of the church, as a member of the Magisterium. Number 2, be concerned for the means and not merely the ends, right? The end, we're all trying to achieve a certain end, but okay, how are you going to do that? Think about the means and being respectful as part of the means. Number 3, contributing toward the reformulation of the teaching. Rather than just criticizing, come up with what it is that, come up with the alternative formulation, if you will. This is where so many of our U.S. nuns have been so good. They've helped us. They don't just criticize the church. They help us to reimagine how the church could be with shared leadership models. Instead of just criticizing an all-male hierarchy, no, that doesn't do any good. Let's talk instead about shared models of leadership. Ooh, that's creative. That's coming up with reformulation of teaching and structures. And then number 4, This is priceless. Count the cost and make sure that you're willing to pay the price that comes with dissent. He says, for instance, anyone who risks public dissent must be convinced that the harm done to oneself by dissenting would be less than the harm caused by not dissenting. I use the own example of my being in the Roman Catholic Church. I have to weigh, do I continue to be silent about the treatment of women in the church forever? Or do I say something knowing that that could put me outside of the church? I have to weigh the risk of that personally and decide which is going to cause greater harm. Okay, standing up and taking the risk is a big risk for me and it could harm me, but I just think that there's more harm by me staying in the church and singing the Mickey Mouse Club song. You follow me? There's more harm done in that way. And each of us has to decide. We have to decide if we're going to dissent on any issue. You stepping out of the Roman Church, if indeed you did, into the American Catholic Church was a risk.
Does
That was
this
a risk.
also, the dissent, does it also pertain to the bishops to the cardinals?
So if you are a bishop in the church, then the way you got to be a bishop was that if you dissented in any way, it was internally or privately. You follow me? We don't name people bishops who have dissented in public ways. Follow me? It's too dangerous. You tend to get like-minded people who are willing not to stir up the waters, not to ruffle the feathers, right? So bishops have to be conscious of these issues too, and most of them may and probably do disagree privately and internally on various issues, but they know, in order for me to remain in this position, what do I have to do? Got to do it. So what Father Richard Goula is saying, if you're going to dissent, here's the way to dissent. We learn this from experience. There are enough nuns and priests and bishops and laypersons who have dissented from the church. Here's a way to do it. Just be conscious of the costs. Be conscious of the costs. Know what you're getting into.
So is the American Catholic Church seen by the Roman Catholic Church as a dissenting organization?
No, because in order to dissent, you have to be part of the organization. If that makes sense. So long as I was a Roman Catholic priest, before I incarnated in the American Catholic Church, I was a dissenter. Right? Stirring the pot, stirring the waters, I was a dissenter. Once I incarnated, I was no longer part of the church. They may, which is why it's interesting, they may still perceive, they may or they may not recognize the incarnation of the American Catholic Church, and they may come back and, pretend to take whatever action. That's their prerogative. Interesting how those of us, this sort of leads as a segue to the next conversation on Catholic social ethics, because they're just different issues that we don't make issues of.
We